Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, I'm Julie. I do everything from book reviews to tarot, and if you're returning, I'm so glad I haven't scared you off. Now today we're going to be talking about a book, more specifically, Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Now this book follows 15-year-old Kambili and her 18-year-old brother Jaja. They live in Enugu, Nigeria, and live in a life of relative privilege. Their father is an entrepreneur, factory owner, and publisher of a prominent newspaper, and even though it may seem on the outside that they live the high life in this mansion-like estate, what really goes on behind closed doors is their religiously zealous father keeps them under tight control, and there's serious consequences for when they disobey him. They really don't know a life outside of this intense control until one holiday they get a chance to spend time with their aunt in Nsukka. Now their aunt, Ifeoma, has children similar in age to Jaja and Kambali, and through interacting with the kids and through interacting with their aunt, they get a taste of what life is like outside of the structure of their father's schedule and outside of his religious zealotry. Their aunt is a university instructor, and she is raising her three children on her own because her husband passed away years before the events of the novel. So we get this sense of an independent woman living outside of what may be considered traditional in that society. And that's really where the term purple hibiscus comes from. Purple hibiscus is the result of a hybrid that Ifeoma and her university colleagues created. And to Kambali, it symbolizes a freedom away from the structures of her previous life, a chance to explore a new side of things. And it's one of those stories where once they get a taste of what life was like with their aunt, the children find themselves unable to blindly accept their father's ways, and it just leads to a whole bunch of tumult in their family unit. Now I had a hard time figuring out how I wanted to approach this review until I read more about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's work and I saw her TED Talk, and she talks about the importance of a diversity of stories. In her TED Talk, she talks about how, you know, people, especially Americans, have this view of Nigerians, and more specifically people who live on the continent of Africa as a whole, as a singular story of poverty, of strife. But in this particular tale, we know Kambali to come from considerable wealth, and running parallel to that, her aunt Ifeoma's family routinely struggles to keep food on the table, and a lot of times, because of the military coup that's underway and the military state that's being created, Ifeoma does not receive paychecks from the university, and their family lives in pretty much poverty. And we see a really interesting interplay between these stories. There's a very wide tapestry, a very big economic gap between just two branches of the same family tree. And we particularly see some interesting perspectives from Kambali's cousin Amaka. She believes that Kambali lives this life of luxury, free of worry, free of care, and parties all the time and goes out with friends and does all these cool things. And while Kambali, you know, generally doesn't have a whole lot of chores in her life, she lives in a constant state of fear due to her father's abusive tendencies, and has a very controlled, regimented schedule that really only allows for study time and family time. And she's not really allowed to socialize with friends, not really allowed to go out. And, you know, even though Ifeoma's family seems like they are struggling, we really do see a life of love and laughter that Kambali and Jaja really attach themselves to. It's one of those age-old lessons that money can't necessarily buy happiness. You know, Kambali, when she returns the first time from her aunt's house in Nsukka, because I believe they go there 3 different times throughout the book, and when she returns the first time, I believe she comments about how empty everything looks, how the ceilings are needlessly high, and how it lacks the character and love of the worn objects in her aunt's house. And it's just interesting how the tables are kind of turned in this scenario. You know, this one side of the family is rich in love and laughter, and that is something that Kambali desperately wants and desperately wishes she could attach herself to. But the she has a lot of social anxiety to come to overcome. I think this book does a really good job at depicting social anxiety as a result of repression, as a result of constantly being dictated by her father. And it's interesting because in Kimbilly, I'm sorry I mispronounced it before, it's Kimbilly. In Kimbilly's father's role as a publisher, one of his big things, because right now they're living in kind of like a military coup right now, where the military is overthrowing the government, he uses the newspaper to speak out against the militaristic powers of this government and tries to speak truth to power whenever he can. But I think it's interesting the parallels that can be drawn, because he expects unquestioning leadership in his own household, while when he's public facing, he has a very different attitude. He has a very different, like, revolutionary attitude. And the father himself is a very complex character. We find later that he's, like, leaving half of his life savings to children's hospitals and churches. And it's like, this outward-facing benefactor really has some dark secrets. We get a sense through the work of Eugene the father, and through kind of the situations that Iphioma faces. We get a sense of the political corruption that exists in this world, about how people are unfairly jailed for speaking out, about how people are, you know, people are left without gas for weeks at a time, and the struggle of, you know, the kind of trickle down of these government scandals. You know, this is a work of fiction, but that doesn't mean it doesn't speak truth to the landscape of Nigeria. Adichie herself grew up in a time of militaristic power, so she can speak truth to that. And you get the sense about how all this stuff affects people differently. You know, Kimbilly's own father doesn't feel the effects of the gas shortage because of his wealth, whereas his own sister does. So it's like, obviously in any society, people, depending on their wealth bracket, are going to experience things differently. But you really do get both sides of the coin in every situation that is explored. Particularly, too, going back to the religious element of things, there is a lot to explore, because there is a lot of talk about the missionary work that goes on in Nigeria, how through missionaries, Eugene, again, the father, was successfully converted to Catholicism, and how growing up kind of in those secondary schools from the missions led him to this very singular attitude of religious strictness. Whereas, you know, even though Iphioma went to the same schools, her path diverged. For example, though Iphioma is Catholic, she has a much more liberal view of things. She's more accepting of her own father, who is still alive at the opening of the novel, than Eugene is. Eugene sees his father, who is a pagan, as a heathen, and he can't associate with him. Whereas Iphioma has a much greater relationship with her father, a much deeper relationship with her father, and more welcoming of him. And Kimbilly also learns that though her grandfather is a pagan, that a lot of similarities can be drawn between his religion and Catholicism, and really it's all about accepting that spiritual energy, and however you label it is however you label it. But even though Kimbilly and Jaja are kind of like our two central characters, I think all of the other characters explored get their fair due, and we know who they are. You know, this book is only well, my copy is 306 pages. Obviously that's going to be different depending on the format you have. And that space is used very judiciously. I felt like everything was pretty thoroughly explored. There's a lot to talk about in terms of class structure, in terms of the political landscape, and I think Adichie really does accomplish what is essentially her thesis in her TED Talk about exploring the tapestry of, you know, stories that exist in any society really, but especially I think the continent of Africa has probably the biggest problem in how it's represented in the media as this place of poverty and strife. And Adichie speaks to the importance of you know, displaying these diverse stories, because it's so limiting and so like it's so limiting, and it's so simple in the worst way to flatten someone's identity. There's a lot to talk about in terms of class structure, the political landscape, the religious landscape, and, you know, essentially what could the book does talk a lot about in terms of the religious aspect. I'll go back to this once more. How kind of the work of the missionaries has whitewashed the Igbo people, for lack of a better term, and how especially people of Eugene's generation are led to glorify the white people that came to their land, and how it's kind of diminishing them of their own, you know, cultural identity. And that was an interesting topic, and one that I think was stated very blatantly and kind of surprising to me. At one point, Eugene pretty much says that white people do Catholicism better than his own people in Nigeria, and I thought that was like an interesting thing to say, kind of a weird thing to say, but I could see where the brainwashing comes from. Anyway, and by the way, all these topics, all these characters are thoroughly explored, and overall I think with this book, Adichie accomplishes what is essentially her thesis in her TED Talk, that it is important to display a tapestry of what it is to be a person in a society. You know, through the characters in this novel, yes, the novel mainly centers on Kimbili and Jaja, but all of the others are very fleshed out, and we get a sense of how each of their, you know, individual experiences and worldview shapes how they function in this world. And I think the idea is to kind of have an eclectic view of what it is to be a person in any society. It's like she says in her TED Talk, it's so damaging and limiting to limit a person to one specific stereotypical story, to have your perception be honed in by one specific thing, is damaging to people in general, and, you know, creates a lot of social barriers to be overcome. I think it all comes back around to the image of the purple hibiscus, something representing freedom and creativity and expression and individuality. The idea that you are your own person and your own experiences help carve out your place in society and help you add unique perspectives and be your own individual. I think there is so much I could say about this book, but I'm not like an English lecturer, so I'm having a hard time really putting it into words, but I'm interested to know your guys' thoughts. I know this book came out some years ago, so odds are a lot of you have read it. I'm interested to know your experience with the book, and if you haven't read it, if you plan to read it. Our next book is going to be Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Let me know if you are interested in that. That was voted on by my lovely patrons, who you will see at the end of the video. If you're interested in joining my Patreon for exclusive benefits, be sure to check out the link below. I will also have the TED Talk that I referred to numerous times linked below. Very interesting points by Adichie. I highly recommend you watch it. And yeah, thanks guys. Have a good one. I almost forgot to rate this book. I'm giving it an 8.5 out of 10. Ratings are arbitrary, but I thoroughly enjoyed it and the ideas explored here. And yeah.